The morning light filtered through the windows of the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo on December 8, 1941, illuminating a scene of unbridled celebration. Staff officers clustered around maps and reports, their voices rising in triumph as they tallied the destruction wrought upon the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 8 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft lay twisted and burning on Hawaiian airfields. The surprise had been complete, the execution flawless. Victory seemed within grasp. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood apart from the celebration, his weathered face a mask of composure that concealed the dread coiling in his chest. Through the window, he watched junior officers embrace and congratulate one another, their youth and enthusiasm blinding them to the catastrophe they had just unleashed. Yamamoto knew what these men did not. He had walked the streets of Detroit, where automobile factories stretched as far as the eye could see, their assembly lines demonstrating a scale of production that Japan could never hope to match. He had stood amid the oil fields of Texas, watching derricks pump black gold from earth so rich in petroleum that a single American field produced more than all of Japan's territories combined. He had observed the casual abundance of American life, the vast agricultural lands, the continental infrastructure, the educational institutions churning out engineers and technicians by the thousands. He knew America in a way that these celebrating officers did not, and that knowledge filled him with foreboding. 6 months before the attack, Yamamoto had met privately with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye, speaking with unusual candor about the war that seemed increasingly inevitable. His words had been precise and prophetic. He could guarantee, he told Konoye, to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months of war with America. Beyond that, he possessed absolutely no confidence about the outcome. If the conflict dragged on for 2 or 3 years, Japan would face certain defeat. Those words echoed in his mind now as he watched his colleagues celebrate what they believed to be a decisive victory. The Pearl Harbor attack had been operationally brilliant, a masterpiece of planning and execution. Yet Yamamoto understood that brilliance in execution could not overcome fundamental disparities in resources and industrial capacity. The American aircraft carriers had escaped the attack, and more critically, Japan had unified a previously divided American nation behind a singular purpose of total war. The mathematics of Japan's eventual defeat were already written in production statistics, resource assessments, and industrial surveys. Yamamoto understood these numbers, even as his fellow commanders dismissed them or rationalized them away. What none of the celebrating officers comprehended was that they had just triggered the most devastating industrial mobilization in human history, an awakening of productive capacity so overwhelming that Japanese military planners, despite their intelligence reports and calculations, despite even their private fears, could not fully grasp its magnitude until the physical evidence became undeniable on battlefields across the Pacific. The psychological collapse of Japanese strategic assumptions had already begun in that moment of celebration. American industrial might would not merely defeat Japan militarily. It would systematically demolish every calculation, every assumption, every hope that the Japanese High Command held about warfare, national power, and their chances of achieving their imperial ambitions. The path to catastrophe had been paved steadily throughout the 1930s with a fatal combination of ambition, desperation, and willful miscalculation. Japan's territorial expansion had accelerated year by year. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, followed by the full-scale war against China beginning in 1937, had demonstrated Japan's determination to carve out a self-sufficient empire in Asia. The occupation of French Indochina in 1940 had brought Japan into direct conflict with Western interests, triggering the oil embargo that would ultimately push Tokyo toward war. Japanese planners understood perfectly well the unfavorable discrepancy between their industrial potential and that of the United States. This awareness shaped their entire war strategy from its inception. The statistics told a sobering story that no amount of optimism could obscure. In 1937, Japan's industrial capacity represented approximately 5.2% of global manufacturing capability. This placed the Japanese Empire roughly equal with France in industrial output and approximately half the capacity of either Great Britain or the Soviet Union. The United States, by stark contrast, commanded nearly 42% of world industrial production. Even in the depths of the Great Depression, when American factories sat idle and millions of workers remained unemployed, American war-making potential remained approximately 7 to 10 times larger than Japan's. These were not estimates or propaganda figures. They were statistics compiled from neutral sources, verified through multiple intelligence channels, and discussed openly in Japanese military planning sessions. Japanese planners knew these numbers. They analyzed them. They discussed their implications in countless meetings. Yet they chose to gamble anyway, betting the fate of their nation on a strategic assumption that rested more on hope than realistic assessment. The gamble hinged on a specific sequence of events unfolding exactly as planned. Japan would deliver a devastating blow to the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, eliminating American carrier power and battleship strength in a single surprise attack. Simultaneously, Japanese forces would sweep across Southeast Asia, seizing the resource-rich territories of the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. These lightning victories would present America with a fait accompli, a defensive perimeter so vast and fortified that the cost of reconquering it in both American lives and treasure would exceed American willingness to fight. Facing the prospect of a protracted, bloody war across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, American public opinion would force Washington to negotiate a settlement recognizing Japan's conquests. Victory depended entirely on American psychology, on the assumption that Americans were too soft, too divided, too unwilling to endure sacrifice to fight back. The Japanese High Command fundamentally misunderstood American character, industrial capacity, and national resolve, projecting their own resource limitations onto an enemy that operated under entirely different economic realities. Admiral Yamamoto understood these American realities better than most of his colleagues. Before the war, he had spent years in America, first as a student at Harvard University and later as a naval attaché in Washington. He had not merely visited America, he had lived there, observed its society, and grasped the implications of its vast scale. He had traveled extensively, witnessing firsthand the productive power that would ultimately crush Japan. In Detroit, he had toured automobile factories where assembly lines produced vehicles with a speed and efficiency that had no parallel in Japan. He had watched workers, many of them women, operating sophisticated machinery that assembled complex products with minimal waste and maximum output. The casual abundance of American civilian life had impressed him deeply. Average Americans possessed automobiles, household appliances, and consumer goods that would be unthinkable luxuries for most Japanese citizens. The agricultural production he observed in the Midwest had astonished him. Single farms in Iowa or Kansas were larger than entire Japanese villages, producing grain in quantities sufficient to feed millions. The oil fields of Texas had been perhaps most revelatory. Standing amid the derricks that stretched to the horizon, watching petroleum flow in seemingly inexhaustible quantities, Yamamoto had understood that America possessed energy resources that Japan could never hope to match, even if it conquered every territory in Southeast Asia. This understanding had led Yamamoto to oppose war with America with an intensity that made him politically vulnerable. He had stated publicly that anyone who had seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas would understand that Japan lacked the national power for a naval race with America. Such statements had earned him enemies among the militarist factions that increasingly dominated Japanese politics. Extremists within the army viewed his caution as defeatism, even treason. His opposition to war had made him a potential assassination target, forcing his transfer to command of the combined fleet, partly to protect him from militant nationalists who saw conflict with the West as inevitable and desirable. Given the task of planning a war he believed Japan could not win, Yamamoto had designed the Pearl Harbor attack as the best possible execution of a fundamentally flawed strategy. He had hoped that a devastating surprise attack might achieve the quick, decisive victory that represented Japan's only chance of success. But hope was not strategy, and Yamamoto's private doubts never translated into sufficient warning for his government. The political momentum toward war had become unstoppable by 1941, driven by army factions who believed that national spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The first 6 months of the Pacific War seemed to validate Japanese strategy with remarkable completeness. The speed and scope of Japanese victories exceeded even optimistic projections. Within days of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces struck American, British, and Dutch possessions throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia with coordinated precision. The Philippines, America's principal colonial possession in Asia, came under immediate assault. Guam and Wake Island, isolated American outposts, fell quickly despite heroic resistance. Hong Kong, Britain's crown colony, surrendered after brief but fierce fighting. Malaya and Singapore, considered impregnable bastions of British power in Asia, collapsed with shocking rapidity as Japanese forces advanced down the peninsula with speed that stunned British commanders. The Dutch East Indies, with their vital oil resources, fell into Japanese hands almost unopened. Burma, gateway to British India, was overrun. By March 1942, just 3 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the Chinese interior to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands near Alaska to the approaches of Australia. The defensive perimeter was established. Raw materials that Japan desperately needed flowed toward the home islands. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Burma, tin and other strategic materials from across the conquered territories. The war seemed to be proceeding exactly according to plan. These victories created dangerous overconfidence among Japanese military leaders, particularly those who had never witnessed American society firsthand. The ease of conquest, the weakness of Allied resistance, and the apparent vindication of their strategy led many commanders to believe that American industrial might had been greatly overstated by pessimists like Yamamoto. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo began planning even more ambitious operations, convinced that America lacked the will to fight back effectively against determined Japanese resistance. The prevailing attitude held that Americans, accustomed to comfortable lives and unwilling to accept casualties, would negotiate once they understood the cost of reconquering Japan's expanded empire. Some officers went further, suggesting that additional offensive operations could expand the defensive perimeter even more, making Japan's position truly unassailable. This overconfidence would lead directly to catastrophic decisions at Midway and elsewhere. Yet even during this period of seemingly unbroken triumph, warning signs appeared for those willing to see them. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, though tactically insignificant in terms of physical damage, demonstrated American determination and capabilities that should have deeply concerned Tokyo. 16 B-25. Mitchell bombers, medium-sized aircraft never designed for carrier operations, had been specially modified and launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet approximately 650 miles from Japan. The bombers struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and other cities before attempting to reach Chinese airfields. The physical damage inflicted was minimal, certainly nothing that would affect Japan's war-making capability. Several dozen Japanese civilians died, and some buildings were destroyed, but in military terms, the raid achieved little. The psychological impact, however, was profound and deeply disturbing. Japanese territory, specifically the sacred homeland that included the Emperor's Palace, had been violated by enemy bombers. The carefully constructed image of Japanese invulnerability had been shattered. If American bombers could reach Tokyo just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, what did that suggest about Japan's defensive capabilities and American determination? The raid exposed Japan's fundamental vulnerability to air attack and prompted the decision to extend the defensive perimeter further eastward, ultimately leading to the Battle of Midway, where Japan would suffer its first decisive defeat. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided another warning that Japanese commanders should have heeded more carefully. The battle was tactically inconclusive, with both sides losing one carrier and suffering damage to others. The Japanese light carrier Shoho was sunk, while the Americans lost the Lexington, a much larger fleet carrier. Damage calculations seemed to favor Japan, yet the strategic outcome clearly favored America. Japan's planned invasion of Port Moresby, which would have threatened Australia and extended Japanese control over New Guinea, was abandoned. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese expansion had been checked. The battle demonstrated that American forces, even when outnumbered and fighting at the limit of their supply lines, could engage the Imperial Japanese Navy to a standstill and achieve strategic objectives. American pilots and sailors had fought with skill and determination that contradicted Japanese assumptions about American fighting spirit. The code-breaking capabilities that had allowed American commanders to anticipate the Japanese operation should have raised alarm bells in Tokyo, but Japanese naval intelligence dismissed the possibility that their codes had been compromised. Then came Midway, the battle fought from June 4th through 7th, 1942, that shattered Japanese naval supremacy and exposed the fatal flaws in their strategic calculations with brutal clarity. Admiral Yamamoto had designed the Midway operation as a trap, an attempt to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle where superior Japanese numbers would destroy them. Japanese intelligence estimated American carrier strength in the Pacific at 2 vessels, Enterprise and Hornet. They believed that Yorktown, badly damaged at Coral Sea, was out of action for months. This assessment was wrong. American shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor had performed near miraculous repairs, working around the clock in 72-hour shifts to return Yorktown to operational status. 3 American carriers would face 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, odds less favorable to Japan than their planners assumed. More critically, American codebreakers had deciphered enough of the Japanese naval communications to understand the basic outline of Japan's operation. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken substantial portions of the Japanese JN-25 code. The Americans understood that a major operation was planned and that the target, designated AF in Japanese communications, was a crucial objective. To confirm that AF meant Midway Atoll, the Americans executed a clever deception. They had Midway send a false message in plain text reporting fresh water shortages. Japanese radio traffic soon mentioned that AF was experiencing water supply problems. The confirmation was complete. The trap that Yamamoto had set for American carriers was reversed. American carriers would be waiting when the Japanese fleet arrived. The battle itself unfolded with devastating speed and finality. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched their first wave of strikes against Midway Atoll itself, following standard doctrine of neutralizing land-based air power before engaging enemy naval forces. While their aircraft were away attacking Midway, American torpedo bombers from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown attacked the Japanese fleet in successive waves. The torpedo attacks were slaughtered with horrific casualties. 41 of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 were shot down, with only 1 pilot surviving. The slow, obsolete Devastators proved easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Yet these doomed attacks achieved something crucial. They drew Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude and scattered the fighters across the fleet. This left the sky clear for American dive bombers that arrived shortly after. At approximately 10:22 in the morning, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived almost simultaneously above the Japanese carriers. The timing was pure coincidence, but its impact was decisive. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu took multiple bomb hits while their flight decks were crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft being prepared for a strike against American carriers. The fires that resulted were catastrophic and uncontrollable. Fuel and munitions exploded, fire spread through hangar decks, damage control efforts were overwhelmed. Hiryu, the fourth carrier, survived the initial attack because it had been operating separately from the other three carriers. It launched two strikes that succeeded in crippling Yorktown, demonstrating that Japanese pilots remained skilled and dangerous. But by evening, American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu and inflicted fatal damage. By June 7th, all four Japanese fleet carriers had sunk, along with the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Japan lost 3,157 men and 248 aircraft. More critically, they lost approximately 100 trained pilots and hundreds of irreplaceable aviation mechanics, technicians, and specialists whose experience could never be adequately replaced. American losses were significantly lighter: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The immediate tactical impact of Midway was clear and acknowledged even by Japanese commanders. Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific and would henceforth fight a defensive war. But the deeper significance of Midway took longer to manifest fully. The battle exposed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese planning, training, industrial capacity, and strategic flexibility that would prove terminal over the following 3 years. Japan had entered the war with 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller light carriers, giving them numerical superiority over American carrier forces. America had begun the war with 3 large carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. The critical question that would determine the war's outcome was not the number of carriers at the start, but the rate at which each nation could replace losses. The answer to that question would systematically devastate every assumption underlying Japanese strategic planning. American industrial mobilization during the Second World War represented the greatest sustained economic and productive effort in human history, an achievement of organization and output that remains unmatched. President Franklin Roosevelt, speaking to Congress less than a month after Pearl Harbor, laid out production goals that seemed fantastic even to his own advisors and military chiefs. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, he announced, increasing to 125,000 in 1943. 120,000 tanks over the same period, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. The numbers seemed impossible to achieve, yet they were met and exceeded year after year. The statistics that documented this mobilization were staggering in scope. In the 3 years following the Battle of Midway, Japanese shipyards constructed exactly 6 aircraft carriers. In the same period, American shipyards delivered 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, and dozens of escort carriers for convoy protection and ground support operations. The Essex-class carriers alone represented an industrial achievement that Japanese planners could barely comprehend. The United States Navy initially ordered 32 Essex-class carriers, though not all were completed before war's end. 24 were actually built, and 14 saw combat service during the Second World War. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 30,000 tons when fully loaded, measured 870 feet in length, and carried more than 90 aircraft. At peak production, American shipyards were launching 1 Essex-class carrier approximately every 6 weeks, a tempo of construction that seemed impossible to Japanese observers who examined captured documents and intelligence reports. The numbers extended across every category of military production, with similar ratios of American superiority. In 1944 alone, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan manufactured during the entire war period from 1939 to 1945. America produced approximately 297,000 aircraft during the war years. Japan produced approximately 76,000. American shipyards delivered more tonnage in the first 4.5 months of 1943 than Japan had launched in 7 years of intensive naval construction. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, converted from automobile production to bomber manufacturing, produced one B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes at peak production, completing 18,000 aircraft total. The massive factory employed 42,000 workers at its height, running 24 hours a day across 3 shifts. The production techniques developed for automobile manufacturing translated seamlessly to aircraft production, demonstrating the depth of American industrial expertise. The numbers extended across every category of war material. American factories built approximately 86,000 tanks during the war, compared to Japan's approximately 2,000 medium and heavy tanks. America produced 2 million trucks to supply its forces. Japan managed approximately 165,000. In artillery pieces, small arms, ammunition, electronics, and every other category, American production exceeded Japanese output by factors ranging from 5 to 20, depending on the specific item. Japanese military planners had access to much of this information through intelligence networks, neutral country sources, and simple observation of equipment appearing in combat. Yet the numbers created cognitive dissonance that prevented proper strategic adjustment. The figures were so overwhelming that accepting them at face value meant accepting inevitable defeat, an outcome psychologically unacceptable to commanders who had staked their careers and their nation's fate on the war. Japanese officers chose instead to hope that the numbers were exaggerated, that American quality would prove inferior to Japanese equipment despite evidence to the contrary, that somehow the tide could be turned through tactical brilliance, superior fighting spirit, and willing self-sacrifice. These hopes sustained morale but prevented realistic strategic reassessment even as the evidence of American material superiority became undeniable on every battlefield. Admiral Yamamoto never suffered these delusions about American capacity. His understanding of American power only deepened as the war progressed and reports of American production reached Tokyo. Historians continue to debate whether Yamamoto actually spoke the famous words attributed to him after Pearl Harbor about awakening a sleeping giant and filling him with terrible resolve. No written record of this exact quotation exists in Japanese or American archives. The line appeared first in the 1970 film Tora, 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 written by screenwriters for dramatic effect. But whether Yamamoto spoke those precise words or not, the sentiment accurately reflected his documented views, expressed in letters and conversations throughout his career. What Yamamoto definitely did write in a letter dated January 9, 1942, was this: "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten." He understood that defeating an unprepared enemy proved nothing about relative strength or the ultimate outcome of conflict. The true test would come when America fully mobilized its industrial might and turned that production toward military purposes. That mobilization gathered momentum throughout 1942 and reached full stride by 1943, transforming the material balance of the war with every passing month. The industrial statistics translated into operational reality across every Pacific battlefield. At Guadalcanal, from August 1942 through February 1943, American forces demonstrated their ability to sustain combat operations across vast oceanic distances, despite initial setbacks and fierce Japanese resistance. The campaign became a grinding, attritional struggle that exposed another critical Japanese vulnerability: logistics, supply, replacement capacity, and industrial depth. Japan had planned for quick, decisive battles that would destroy enemy forces and secure territory, not for sustained operations that drained resources month after month. The Japanese merchant fleet, essential for supplying far-flung garrisons and transporting resources back to the home islands, steadily eroded under relentless American submarine attack. Japanese merchant ship production never came close to matching losses. In 1943, American submarines sank more Japanese merchant tonnage than Japanese shipyards could launch as replacements. By 1944, Japan's merchant marine was in terminal decline, unable to supply captured territories adequately or transport resources back to factories that needed them. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, the vital resource that Japan had gone to war to secure, increasingly remained undelivered as tankers fell victim to American torpedoes. Without oil, the fleet could not sortie. Without raw materials, factories could not produce. Without transport capacity, armies could not be supplied. Japanese aircraft production illustrated similar patterns of declining capability. While American factories churned out newer, better designs in massive and ever-increasing quantities, Japanese production stagnated both in absolute numbers and technological advancement. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, brilliant and revolutionary when introduced in 1940, remained in frontline service throughout the war with only minor modifications. American fighters progressed through multiple generations during the same period, from the adequate F-4F Wildcat to the superior F-6F Hellcat to the exceptional F-4U Corsair, each iteration outperforming its predecessor in speed, climb rate, armament, and survivability. By 1943, American fighters were demonstrably better than comparable Japanese designs, and they appeared in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese air units defending every position. The pilot training differential compounded these material advantages dramatically. America's vast educational infrastructure supported massive pilot training programs that produced skilled aviators in enormous numbers. Aviation cadets received thorough instruction in multi-engine aircraft, navigation, aerial tactics, and gunnery. Completion rates remained high throughout the war, and the pipeline of new pilots grew steadily. Japan's training programs, increasingly constrained by fuel shortages and aircraft losses, were forced to shorten training periods and reduce standards progressively. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with a small fraction of the flight hours their American counterparts received, sometimes less than 100 hours total flying time compared to several hundred for American pilots. Superior American aircraft flown by better-trained pilots produced entirely predictable results. Japanese aircrew losses became unsustainable, creating a death spiral where inadequately trained replacement pilots died even faster, requiring even more inadequately trained replacements. Yet even as evidence of American industrial supremacy mounted month after month, many Japanese commanders clung to hope grounded in cultural concepts that emphasized spirit over material. The idea of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, suggested that superior morale, dedication, and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Bushido traditions emphasized honor, sacrifice, loyalty, and death before surrender. These cultural factors produced individual acts of remarkable courage and determination, but prevented realistic strategic reassessment at the command level. Officers who suggested that Japan might need to seek peace terms were viewed as defeatist or potentially traitorous. The cultural imperative to fight on, regardless of circumstances, became increasingly divorced from military reality. The fall of the Mariana Islands in summer 1944 marked the moment when even the most optimistic Japanese commanders could no longer maintain comfortable illusions about the war's trajectory. The American invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944, with a massive amphibious assault supported by overwhelming naval gunfire and abundant supplies. American forces, equipped with the latest weapons and supported by seemingly limitless ammunition, steadily overcame fierce Japanese resistance. The fighting was savage and prolonged, with Japanese soldiers and civilians choosing death over capture in accordance with instructions from Tokyo. Mass suicides of civilians on Saipan's cliffs shocked American troops who witnessed them. But the outcome was never in doubt from the moment American forces secured beachheads. Saipan fell on July 9th after nearly a month of brutal combat. Tinian followed on August 1st. Guam, an American possession before the war, was secured by August 10th after similar fighting. The strategic implications of losing the Marianas were dire and immediately apparent. The islands placed American B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, approximately 1,500 miles away. The carefully constructed defensive perimeter that was supposed to make American reconquest prohibitively expensive had been penetrated at its core. Japan itself now faced direct strategic bombing of its cities and industries. The loss demonstrated conclusively that Japan could no longer prevent American advances anywhere. The overwhelming American superiority in ships, aircraft, supplies, ammunition, and trained personnel meant that American forces could strike any target they chose and prevail through sheer material advantage. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, who had pushed Japan into war and led the government since October 1941, received blame for the Mariana disaster. Political and military factions that had supported the war now sought scapegoats. Tojo was forced to resign on July 18, 1944, having lost the political support necessary to continue. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an impossible situation. The war was effectively lost in any objective military assessment, but surrender remained politically and culturally unthinkable. Japan would continue fighting, hoping desperately for some miracle that would never materialize. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought on June 19 and 20, 1944, concurrent with the Mariana landings, provided yet another demonstration of American material supremacy that should have ended any remaining Japanese illusions. Japanese naval aviation, attempting to attack American carriers supporting the Mariana invasion, was systematically destroyed in what American pilots mockingly called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of intensive air combat, Japan lost approximately 480 aircraft and 3 carriers, including the newest carrier Taiho. American losses were comparatively trivial. Japanese naval aviation, already weakened by years of attrition and inadequate pilot training, never recovered from this massacre. The remaining Japanese carriers, without adequate air groups to operate from them, became floating hulks with limited military value. American commanders now understood conclusively that they held overwhelming advantages in every aspect of naval warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, and General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Southwest Pacific Forces, planned and conducted operations with confidence born of material abundance. When American forces prepared for amphibious landings, planners assumed generous supply ratios, abundant ammunition stocks, and continuous reinforcement. Japanese defenders, by contrast, fought with dwindling supplies, scarce ammunition, no prospect of relief, and orders to die in place rather than retreat. The psychological impact on Japanese troops was devastating. Soldiers knew that no help would come, that defeat was certain, and that they were expected to die rather than surrender. The Philippines campaign, conducted from October 1944 through July 1945, exemplified this fundamental disparity in material resources and its psychological consequences. American forces landed on Leyte on October 20, 1944, supported by the largest naval armada yet assembled in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy, recognizing that the Philippines represented their last chance to inflict a decisive defeat on American forces, committed virtually all remaining operational vessels to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The 4-day battle from October 23rd through 26th destroyed Japanese naval power as an effective fighting force. American carrier aircraft sank the massive battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, and one of the 2 largest battleships ever constructed. In Surigao Strait, American battleships and destroyers annihilated a Japanese southern force in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. Off Samar, a Japanese center force encountered American escort carriers in a confused action where Japanese command failures and American heroism prevented potential disaster. Finally, off Cape Engano, American carriers destroyed the remnants of Japanese carrier forces in a one-sided slaughter. By October 26th, Japanese naval power had effectively ceased to exist as an organized, coherent force. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and thousands of irreplaceable trained seamen. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again sortie in fleet strength. Japanese naval officers understood that the war was lost, yet orders from Tokyo demanded continued resistance regardless of cost. The strategic bombing of Japan, which intensified throughout 1944 and 1945, brought the war's industrial implications to their most devastating and terrible conclusion. The bombing campaign began with high-altitude precision attacks against specific industrial targets, following the doctrine developed in Europe. Results were disappointing due to weather conditions, jet stream winds at high altitude, and the dispersion of Japanese industry into small workshops throughout urban areas. American commanders shifted to nighttime incendiary attacks against Japanese cities, which were constructed primarily of wood and paper and were extremely vulnerable to fire. The raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9th through 10th, 1945, was the single most destructive air attack in human history. 334 B-29 bombers dropped approximately 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo's densely packed residential and industrial districts. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and left more than 1 million people homeless. The attack was more deadly than either atomic bombing that would follow months later. The campaign against Japanese cities continued with ruthless efficiency. 66 other major cities suffered similar incendiary attacks over subsequent months. By war's end, approximately 350,000 to 500,000 Japanese civilians had died in the strategic bombing campaign, and major industrial cities were reduced to ash and rubble. Yet even this destruction, even watching their cities burn, did not break Japanese willingness to resist. The military government, dominated by army officers committed to fighting to national extinction if necessary, refused to consider surrender terms. Emperor Hirohito, who traditionally remained above political and military decisions in accordance with Japan's constitutional structure, became increasingly concerned as reports revealed the true situation. The emperor received regular briefings on the war's progress from military chiefs. By early 1945, he understood that Japan faced certain defeat and that continuing the war only multiplied civilian casualties. Yet the emperor's constitutional position and the political strength of hardline army factions prevented him from directly ordering surrender. Japan's government was paralyzed between the reality of certain defeat and the cultural impossibility of accepting that defeat. Military officers spoke openly about continuing resistance through a final battle on the home islands, where civilian population would be armed with bamboo spears and instructed to die fighting the invaders. This national suicide plan was presented seriously by officers who had lost all contact with strategic reality. The Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan on August 8, 1945, shattered Japan's last diplomatic hope. Japanese leaders had attempted throughout 1945 to use Soviet neutrality as a potential path to negotiated settlement. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941 had allowed both nations to focus their efforts elsewhere: the Soviets against the European enemy, the Japanese against the Western Allies. Japanese diplomats worked desperately to convince the Soviets to mediate peace terms with America and Britain, perhaps securing conditions short of unconditional surrender. This hope was entirely delusional. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had promised Roosevelt and Churchill to enter the war against Japan within 90 days of the European enemy's defeat. That deadline was met with precision. On August 8th, exactly 90 days after European surrender, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. Soviet armies, hardened by years of combat in Europe and equipped with massive amounts of artillery and armor, crushed Japanese forces that had been stripped of resources to defend the home islands. In 1 week, Soviet forces overran Japanese positions in Manchuria that had taken years to construct. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most formidable military formation, disintegrated under Soviet assault. The Soviet invasion meant Japan now faced enemies on all fronts with no prospect of diplomatic escape, no possibility of negotiated terms, and no hope of avoiding total defeat. Yet even this final catastrophe did not immediately produce surrender. The Japanese government, particularly hardline army leadership, proposed continuing the war through a final decisive battle on Japanese soil. This fantasy of redemptive victory persisted even after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. The bombs killed approximately 130,000 people initially, with tens of thousands more dying later from radiation effects. The scale of destruction from single bombs should have ended any debate about continuing resistance. Yet within Japan's military government, army officers argued that surrender remained dishonorable, regardless of circumstances. Only Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention, breaking with constitutional precedent and centuries of tradition, forced Japan's capitulation. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's recorded voice was broadcast to the Japanese people announcing surrender. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had heard their emperor speak. His words carefully avoided the term surrender, instead announcing that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, a euphemism so indirect it initially confused listeners. The announcement stunned a population that propaganda had assured was winning the war. The reality of defeat, suddenly and officially acknowledged, shattered the carefully constructed narrative that had sustained Japanese morale. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, oversaw Japan's occupation and reconstruction. The occupation exposed Japanese people directly to American material abundance and organizational efficiency in ways that completed the psychological demolition of wartime assumptions. American soldiers arrived with equipment, supplies, and resources that Japanese civilians had never imagined existed in such quantities. The occupation forces were well-fed, well-equipped, and supported by logistics that seemed miraculous to a population that had been starving. For Japanese military leaders, post-war interrogation and war crimes trials forced painful acknowledgement of their catastrophic failures in judgment. Former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, on trial for war crimes that would result in his execution, was forced to admit publicly that Japan had fundamentally underestimated American industrial capacity and national determination. "We did not adequately understand the American potential," he testified before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. This represented an extraordinary admission from a man who had led Japan into war, confident of achieving victory through superior spirit and tactical skill. Post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese military personnel revealed systematic failures in understanding that extended far beyond simple production statistics. Japanese planners had failed to appreciate American ability to project power across vast oceanic distances while maintaining adequate supply lines. They had underestimated American technological innovation and the speed at which American industry could incorporate new developments into production. Most critically, they had failed to understand that American military doctrine emphasized achieving and maintaining material advantage rather than relying on warrior spirit or accepting casualties as inevitable. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier striking force at both Pearl Harbor and Midway, died by suicide during the Battle of Saipan in July 1944 rather than face capture. But his surviving staff officers provided detailed testimony about Japanese planning assumptions. They acknowledged that Japanese intelligence had provided accurate information about American industrial production throughout the pre-war period. The failure was not in intelligence gathering, but in strategic assessment. Japanese commanders had known the production numbers, but refused to accept their implications for war outcomes. They had convinced themselves that American advantages in material could be offset by Japanese advantages in spirit, training, and tactical skill. This fundamental misassessment had led directly to decisions that doomed Japan to defeat. Post-war analysis by both Japanese and American historians identified the core of Japan's strategic failure with painful clarity. Japan had gambled on a short war because Japanese leaders understood perfectly well they could not win a protracted conflict. But the gamble rested entirely on assumptions about American psychology that proved completely wrong. Japanese planners believed Americans were soft, decadent, divided by racial and economic tensions, and fundamentally unwilling to endure hardship or accept casualties. Pearl Harbor, they believed, would shock Americans into accepting Japanese hegemony in Asia rather than fight a long, costly war to reverse it. Instead, the surprise attack unified American society behind total war with an intensity that surprised even American leaders. Roosevelt's production goals, which had seemed fantastic in December 1941, were met and exceeded because American industry, labor, and agriculture fully mobilized for sustained effort. Women entered factories in massive numbers, taking positions previously reserved for men. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically through mechanization and improved techniques. Raw material extraction expanded across every sector. The American economy grew at approximately 15% annually throughout the war years, while simultaneously supporting massive military production, maintaining civilian consumption at adequate levels, and providing extensive aid to allied nations through programs like Lend-Lease. The contrast with Japan's economic performance could not have been more stark. Japan's economy, far smaller at the war's beginning, faced crippling constraints that worsened year by year. American submarine warfare devastated Japan's merchant fleet, progressively cutting off the flow of resources from conquered territories back to Japanese factories. Strategic bombing destroyed urban manufacturing capacity and killed skilled workers. The naval blockade reduced Japanese industrial output through raw material shortages that became catastrophic by 1945. By war's end, Japanese aircraft production had declined to approximately 150 aircraft per month, while American production exceeded 8,000 monthly. Japanese soldiers in the field faced ammunition shortages so severe that orders sometimes restricted rifle fire. American forces, by contrast, had ammunition in such abundance that commanders encouraged its liberal use to minimize casualties. Several former Japanese officers, in memoirs and interviews conducted decades after the war, offered remarkably frank assessments of their strategic failures that revealed how completely they had misunderstood the nature of industrial warfare. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who served as the last commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1950 memoirs that Japan had fought a war it could not win from the very beginning. "We understood American material superiority intellectually," he wrote, "but we did not grasp its implications emotionally or strategically. We believed that spirit could overcome matter, that determination could defeat abundance. This was our fundamental error, and it cost millions of lives." Mitsumasa Yonai, who served as Prime Minister and Navy Minister at various points during the war, told American interrogators in 1945 that Japanese naval officers had repeatedly warned civilian leaders that war with America was unwinnable. These warnings, he said, were systematically ignored by army leaders who controlled government policy and who believed that national will could compensate for material deficiencies. Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving fighter ace with 64 confirmed victories, wrote extensively after the war about the progressive decline in the quality of Japanese pilots and aircraft as the conflict wore on. In his autobiography Samurai, published in 1957, Sakai described watching newly trained pilots deployed to combat with minimal flight hours and inadequate preparation. They were slaughtered by experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. They never had a chance against enemies who had every material advantage. By 1944, we veteran pilots knew conclusively that we were losing the war. We could see the quality of American aircraft improving continuously while our designs stagnated. We could see the numbers of American planes increasing exponentially while ours declined. We kept fighting because we had no choice, because surrender was culturally unthinkable, but we knew the end was inevitable. The industrial statistics that documented Japan's defeat in precise numerical terms were compiled after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which conducted exhaustive analysis of both American and Japanese production. The final accounting was stark and definitive. America had produced approximately two-thirds of all Allied military equipment during the war, an achievement of industrial mobilization without historical parallel. American factories built more than 5,000 ships of all types during the war years. American shipyards replaced all Allied shipping sunk by enemy action and then built additional capacity beyond pre-war global tonnage. Japanese production, by comparison, had proven utterly inadequate to sustain a major war. Japan built 6 aircraft carriers after Midway in 3 years of maximum effort. America built 122 carriers of all types during the same period. Japan produced 76,000 aircraft total throughout the entire war. America produced nearly 300,000 aircraft in 4 years. Japan built approximately 165,000 trucks during the war. America built 2 million military trucks. In steel production, oil refining, aluminum fabrication, electronics manufacturing, and every other category of industrial output, American production exceeded Japanese capacity by factors ranging from 10 to 20, depending on the specific category measured. The human cost of Japan's catastrophic miscalculation was staggering and almost beyond comprehension. Approximately 2,800,000 Japanese military personnel died in the war, killed in combat, from disease, or from starvation when garrisons were cut off and left without supplies. Between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese civilians died from bombing, starvation, disease, and war-related causes. These casualties, totaling perhaps 3.5 million Japanese deaths, occurred in a war that Japanese leaders had initiated while understanding at some level that it was unwinnable. The moment of true realization came at different times for different individuals within the Japanese High Command. Some officers, like Yamamoto, understood from the beginning that Japan could not win a protracted war against American industrial power. Others maintained comfortable delusions until specific events forced confrontation with reality. For some, the realization came when Saipan fell and B-29s began burning Japanese cities. For others, it came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf when the Navy was destroyed. For the most deluded, understanding perhaps came only with the atomic bombings or the Emperor's surrender announcement. But eventually, all surviving Japanese military leaders confronted the same inescapable truth. Japan had fought a war against an industrial power so superior that defeat was mathematically certain from the beginning. The only variables were the duration of the conflict and the scale of casualties. In the decades following the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s, the lessons of 1941 to 1945 fundamentally shaped Japanese thinking about power, prosperity, and international relations. Modern Japan achieved far greater influence and success through trade, industry, and peaceful enterprise than the militarist government ever gained through conquest and war. The industrial capacity and access to resources that Japanese leaders in the 1930s sought to seize through military force was ultimately developed and exceeded through peaceful economic development. The irony was not lost on Japanese historians and strategists analyzing their nation's catastrophic miscalculation. The story of Japan's high command, finally realizing and acknowledging America's true industrial power, serves ultimately as a cautionary tale about the profound dangers of strategic self-deception and willful blindness to uncomfortable realities. Information about American productive capacity was readily available to Japanese planners throughout the pre-war period. Warnings about the impossibility of victory were given repeatedly by informed officers like Yamamoto. Evidence of American material advantages accumulated from the earliest battles. Yet institutional momentum, cultural biases emphasizing spirit over material, and political constraints prevented rational strategic reassessment until defeat became undeniable and surrender unavoidable. For individual Japanese officers, The realization of American industrial supremacy came through varied experiences at different moments. Some witnessed it in the endless streams of American aircraft that darkened Pacific skies.